Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Rob. This is Two Bi Guys. But first, and in case you've been living under a rock, Two Bi Guys is now part of the Zencastr Creator Network, and Zencastr is recruiting brands who want to advertise on independent podcasts like this one. Zencastr's team doesn't rely on traditional user ad tracking. Instead, they match your brand to the perfect podcasts using context. So whether you want to advertise on a queer relationship podcast like this one, or maybe a podcast about video games or gardening or hiking or politics or whatever is relevant to your brand, you can find the perfect fit in the Zencastr Creator Network. Zencastr's mission is to make podcast advertisements as easy and accessible to business owners as Google or Facebook ads. And Zencastr's new podcast marketplace allows brands and podcasters to negotiate directly, to collaborate to improve the success of each ad dollar spent, and to form long-term relationships. Zencastr has already proven that with the right fit, ads on smaller podcasts can outperform ads on bigger ones in a variety of verticals, allowing them to work with all podcasters. Zencastr Creator Network has really helped me as a podcast, even though we're not one of the biggest podcasts out there. We do have a loyal following of people who are very engaged with our content. Thank you all for listening. I see you. I love you. And because of that, I'm able to monetize the work I'm doing now, even on this medium-sized scale, which allows me to keep the podcast going. And Zencastr partners me with brands that I have an authentic interest in, so it's a win-win. Podcasts on the Zencastr Creator Network reach dedicated listeners and will give your brand a chance to connect with consumers in a way that traditional advertising can't. So are you interested in sponsoring this show or podcast ads for your business? Go to zen.ai/2biguys0 and fill out the contact information so Zencastr can help you bring your business story to life. Hello and welcome to Two Bi Guys. I am Rob and I'm here with a very special guest today, a bisexual researcher and influencer and activist, Dr. Julia Shaw. Welcome to Two Bi Guys.
Nice to be here.
So nice to have you after I've been reading your tweets and consuming your output for many years. So Dr. Julia Shaw is a psychological scientist at University College London. She is the author of multiple best-selling books. She's a BBC science communicator. She's best known for her work in the areas of false memory, criminal psychology, and bisexuality. And her third book is coming out this summer, 2022. It's called Bi, The Hidden Culture, History, and Science of Bisexuality. The book is an eye-opening, rigorous, and personal exploration of sexuality, which we're going to talk about. I had a chance to skim through the book, and there are many, many things to discuss. It's quite comprehensive. And Dr. Shaw is also the founder of the Bisexual Research Group, and she is part of queer politics at Princeton University. So welcome again to Two Bi Guys. So nice to have you.
So nice to be here. I've listened to many of the episodes of this podcast, and I always enjoy the people that you have on. So it's very nice to join a good group of people.
That's awesome. Yeah, well, I'm very interested in this kind of work, so it makes sense there's a lot of overlap because I was a psychology major in college and I almost really went down that route. In some ways I sort of have without realizing it. And the other route I went is stuff you have experience with too, with media and film and TV. And so we'll have a lot to talk about. We'll have way too much that we can't get through in the podcast. So everyone buy the book when it comes out. So before we get into the book, can you tell us first, how do you identify? What pronouns do you use? And how did you come to that identity, whatever labels you like to use?
So I identify as a bisexual woman with she, her pronouns. And I have identified as bisexual since I was a teenager. So basically, wow. I've never had since I've had a label at all, I've never had a different one. I think there was a while when I was sort of in my early teens that I probably wouldn't have used the word bi, but I wouldn't have used any word. So I think that's fair. But I did come out as bi to my mom almost by accident when I was a teenager, because she noticed that I was in a relationship with another girl. And she sat me down on this blue couch that we had at the time. And she's like, so I notice you've been spending a lot of time with her name. And, it doesn't matter. It's fine. But like, are you a lesbian? And so that was almost a forced moment, right? Where I was like, well, no, but I needed to then label it. And so I think that was the moment where I was probably about 15. I labeled it as bi. And yeah, so I've identified as bisexual ever since.
That's interesting. It's funny. Alex, my co-host, isn't here, but he has a very similar story of his parents confronting him at around age, I think 14 or 15. But at that time, he didn't have the bi knowledge in his head to even realize that's what I should say, or that's what I might be. So his parents asked, "Are you gay?" And he just said, "Yeah." And then for years, he had kind of got pushed into that gay label, and it took him a while to realize bi. So I guess I'm curious, like so many people, bisexuality is quite invisible often until later in life. How do you think you realized it so early? Like what clued you in your upbringing?
That's an excellent question. And I actually don't really know the answer to that. So I grew up in a very queer city. So I grew up in Cologne, which is in Germany, which is a queer hub. It is absolutely, since it turns out now that I know my queer history, since like 1900, it's been just like a safe place for queer people. Barring a few years of Nazi reign. But other than that, it was literally where people would escape to from places like the UK. They would go to Cologne. Mm-hmm. And that is something that I obviously wasn't aware of when I was a kid. But I think there's this long, long history of pride events, of Christopher Street Day, as we call it in Cologne, and related just a queer scene. And so I think through that, I sort of absorbed it, even though I don't know any family friends. I didn't have any friends at the time who identified as bi. So it wasn't that there was like a person or a role model I could point at and say, ooh, I'm like them. It was more that I wasn't the other two labels, so I have to be this one. Because labels like pan and fluid and all these things weren't really around when I was a kid.
Right. Interesting. That makes sense. I mean, I can see that, how it could just be kind of in the ether and it gets into you without anything explicit. So then you told your mom at age 15, and then like, what happened after that? How'd you get from there to like bi activist and bi research group? Like, when did you start coming out and making this a part of your career?
Much later. So I was out to my partners and most of my friends for most of my university life and later. But I wasn't out at work and I wasn't out publicly. And when I started to build a social media profile, I wasn't out there either until I decided in my second book to come out. And my second book is on evil and criminal psychology. And it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek title because the whole idea is that evil is this thing that I'm trying to deconstruct with the book. And it's actually a word that I really don't like us using because it dehumanizes others. And within that, I had a section on how some people perceive LGBT plus people and lives as evil. And so within that, it was sort of the consensus seems to be that one of the main things we can change is visibility. And visibility often leads to and is related to legal changes that protect our human rights. And so I was writing this and I was writing about how, almost the ridiculousness of seeing these identities as evil, but also try to empathize with that perspective. Simultaneously, I was like, be visible. And then I actually write, I'm like, I'm such a hypocrite. So I wrote in the book that I'm being a hypocrite because I wasn't visible. And so who am I to say be visible if I'm still in the closet? Like, what kind of advice is that? And so I came out in the book. And that was also, I had a long conversation with my editor about this because I was so worried about being hypersexualized because I'm already or certainly was at that point, a young female academic, and I was in the public eye. And as a young woman on the internet, we're all familiar with, the internet and the trolls that live there.
What are you talking about?
Exactly. And unfortunately, I was being sexualized already. And so I was very, very conscious of not making it worse. And so that's one of the conversations we had is this going to make the internet unbearable for me? And it didn't. The outcome was very good, but I was very concerned about that.
Interesting. Yeah, well, good for you. And that's so cool that the things you realized in the book kind of pushed you to come out yourself. I have a question about like identity and bisexuality, and like something you said made me think of like, you know, this, the invisibility of bisexuality, and this, like, it's other things can be all consuming. I have a quote from your book I want to ask you about. You wrote, "We center heterosexuality as the sun of our sexual solar system, blinding our exploration of other sexualities. I don't think that everybody is bi, as I so often half jokingly state. Rather, I believe it is time to queer our worldview by destabilizing our assumptions about sex and sexuality." So I guess I'm curious, like, I love the word bisexual too, and it's the first word I usually use in addition to others like queer or fluid. But it does feel like it's very rooted in this moment. The word bisexual is like a, you know, anti-heterosexual, which is all encompassing. Like, how do you see this identity? Do you see it like shifting in the future? Do you see like a no labels world as the future, or like, I don't know, how do you think about this label in this moment?
So bisexual is a word that has been often misunderstood and sometimes say, willfully misconstrued. It's been basically politically weaponized at various times in history. And at times, the bis are welcome within the queer community. And at other times, they're not. And it's sort of like, well, right now, actually, monosexual is easier to present as what's called an immutable characteristic. So something that can't be changed. But people in the middle, that fluidity, that makes it a bit complicated. And it makes it harder to argue that we should have the same kinds of rights as, say, other things that people often consider immutable. So those are often what are called protected characteristics or protected classes. So things that are, you know, held in law as something that is protected and that you can't be discriminated based on, for example. And you can see why then with the sort of nuance that bisexuality introduces. I mean, some might argue the reality that bisexuality introduces, that it does make it a slightly more complicated political argument. But the result of that has been pushing out the bis, and then when it's convenient, also sort of being like, come back now. We like you now. We like the strength in numbers. Oh, come back to our marches. Come back to the things. And it's not even me being like particularly angry at the queer community for doing this. I can see the logistics of it, and the fight for rights has been a long and hard struggle. But it is all the more reason to embrace the word bi, because it has for so long been erased and politicized by all sides. And it has always meant attraction to same and other genders. It has never meant that it's enforcing some sort of gender binary of only men and women. Like from the beginning, from its inception, that is not what it has meant. So anyone who says that's what it means, that is incorrect. And so it's also not transphobic. It's not all of these things that we hear all the time.
Yeah.
So I like bi because it has a long history and most people know what it means, even if they don't really understand the nuance. But they kind of get it, and it's useful to communicate what it is you are, because queer is a bit broad.
Right.
Queer could mean lots of things.
Right. It's very interesting how you kind of have to sort of be aware of both of these things, like the identity on the personal level and what is the best version of your own self-actualization and like identity and presenting yourself to the world. But then it really is like a political thing that we're doing, because however you describe it, it's going to be anti-heteronormative and going to fight against some power structures. So it's an interesting balance. Okay, we'll get back to the politics of it later. I have more to ask you about that. But let's get into the book right from the beginning. I also want to ask you about the science stuff that I'm particularly interested in. But I want to read the very first paragraph of your book because it resonated with me so much. I just started at the beginning and I was like, wow, right away, identifying. You wrote, this is the first line: "I am bisexual and I have long felt myself wanting more. I have yearned to tether myself to a solid foundation of history and research, to find bi-representation in politics and pop culture, and to generally answer the question, where are all the bisexual people?" So our first episode of this podcast was literally called "Where Are All the Bi Guys?" And that idea of wanting more, not seeing ourselves because of invisibility, knowing there's more out there, but not knowing exactly where to go to find it and discovering it is just something I've heard so many bi people experience. So can you tell us a little more about that and why you started the book that way and how that manifests in your life?
I can't. Also, my cat has decided to join us. This is
Oh,
Luna.
hi, cat. This You're continuing a good tradition of animals
Okay,
interrupting the
goodbye.
podcast. This
It's
show will be
just
called Two Bi Guys and Their Animals.
for Bad People, which is my podcast on the BBC. We both have pets. So my co-host Sophie Hagen, who's also by coincidence, genuinely, by coincidence,
By coincidence.
but they have a dog and I have a cat, and they are both in our cover art now because they interrupted so much during lockdown, especially that it was just we had to include them because they're basically our co-stars.
Cute.
But the question of representation and I've totally forgotten the question.
Like the idea of wanting more, knowing that there's something more out there, just seems to be kind of a bi thing.
Of course, it's a bi thing because I feel like there's this understanding that there must be more, and we like occasionally meet other bi people, and it's like, okay, so we exist, and if you look at statistics, because you do occasionally as a human being has any interest in sexuality stumble upon the statistics about bisexual people, and you go, wow, that's a big percentage of the queer community. That is often the majority of the queer community, if it's sort of the majority of the minority, right? And so it's a question that of like, but I don't know anybody, so there must be more to this, or there's something I don't know. And so I think there is that search for the unknown because no one's ever shared it with us, and it's really hard to find. The reason I wrote this book, and I write this in the conclusion, is that this book didn't exist. I didn't set out to be like, I'm going to become an expert on bisexuality. That was not what I wanted. What I went looking for is a bunch of really good books, and there are really good books, but they're disproportionately autobiographical. There's sort of case studies, and then there's really academic books. So that's sort of what I was seeing, at least at the beginning. And even those, if you don't know what words to use, if you don't know where to go, they're really hard to find. And that's starting to change. There's starting to be a bit more visibility of bi books, but I also don't know how much that is just because I've now followed all the bi people. So it just looks like it. I don't know. But certainly at the beginning, a few years ago, I was like, I can't find the answers to the questions I have. And that's what set me out on this journey to figure it out and to go read the studies. Because as soon as I started learning the language, learning that, men who have sex with men is often a descriptor for bisexual men, for example, learning that queer and fluid and bi plus and polysexual and plurisexual, and like there's all these terms that are used that aren't used in everyday language. Like we don't know those words unless we have an interest or a deep understanding of the queer community. And so you need to learn the language and then you can start to look. But even that, I mean, most of the stuff that I reference in the book is behind a paywall. I need a university level access to even get to those studies, never mind to summarize them, never mind to be able to interpret them. Like there's all these barriers to even finding this stuff. And that's also why when I started my journey, one of the first things I did, because I was finding out more about like bisexual geckos than bisexual people when I first started in Google Scholar. Genuinely, I was like, is this just in the animal world? Like and there it usually means, hermaphroditic geckos. Yeah. It's not even used in the same way. I was like, surely there is research. And so I went looking, and then I again sort of found this void, and I didn't believe it because I knew there was more, hence the hunt for more. And so I put out a tweet and I asked, does anyone want to found a bisexual research group with me? And that was my attempt to be like, I'm just going to see if they can come to me because I can't find them. And sure enough, within 24 hours, 20 people had responded, and I just connected them all. And then we did, and then more and more joined, and they sort of brought their friends. And over time, we have about 60 members who are all actively bi researchers. And we just did monthly sessions, and we would just teach. Well, they would mostly teach me, frankly. And I would just listen patiently and learn. And it was so good.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the Bisexual Research Group because, I was a psychology major and I got none of this in my education. It was totally invisible to me. I took a whole class on human sexuality that was all about procreation and heterosexuality, and homosexuality is a byproduct that nobody can explain. And I was like, I don't, eventually at first I took it at face value, but eventually I'm like, really? Is that all there is? Shouldn't there be some people researching this? So I'm glad you found them and got them together. That's like such an amazing thing to do, and hopefully yielding results. Yeah.
And what was surprising, or maybe not surprising, given that it's so hard to find this stuff, is that they were also largely invisible to each other. And I think that's why they latched onto the group, because all these bi researchers are hiding in different disciplines and different universities around the world. And you do sort of need a centralized place to go. And I think in some ways, actually, the pandemic was helpful for encouraging people to connect online. And so me starting this early pandemic was really a good time for it, because people were seeking connection. And that was, wherever you were in the world, we would try to adjust the times of it and make sure people could attend and participate. And it was an incredible joy for me to see these academics who were so passionately talking about like bisexual motherhood. They were talking about religion and bisexuality, talking about intersectionality between sort of trans identities and Black identities, and sort of different experiences from different people, and how that intersects with bisexuality. And it was just something, frankly, most of it I'd never thought about. It didn't occur to me that these were things that people could study or experiences that people had. And so it was just such a joy.
I've read a lot of the books you're probably talking about. I had a couple of years where I just read everything I could find that had the word bi in it. But yours is so comprehensive. It really touches on sort of every topic that you would want to know about, at least initially. And it's a really nice mix of like the academics and the science with like a down to earth tone, and also like coming out stories and coming out in the workplace and like the politics of it. So it really spans everything. But I want to start with the science stuff because I'm so fascinated by it. And I kind of actually want to start with like a statistics question. I don't know if that's silly, but like, you talked about bi people make up usually more than half of the queer community in most studies. That we know there's a lot of people who identify as somewhere in the middle of the Kinsey scale, even if they use the label straight or gay. So I'm curious, like, how many bisexual people do you think there are out there? However you want to define bi. Like, I don't know if do we define bi by what they think they like, by self-determination or by something else? Or what do you think the numbers are actually?
It's kind of an impossible question to answer because it also depends on at what point in people's lives. So I think that a lot of people, research bears out that a lot of people, perhaps even most, will have at least one same-sex attraction in their lives if they identify as heterosexual. And so that means, and often the other way around as well. So a lot of people who are basically monosexual people often will have an attraction that doesn't fit with their monosexual identity. So if you identify as gay, you might still, at some point in your life, find a woman who you find really attractive, who maybe you fall in love with, who you want to have a sexual relationship with or other kind of relationship with. Or you might fall in love with someone who's non-binary, or, someone who isn't the gender you think you are mostly or exclusively attracted to. And so that's the same for heterosexual people, is that most heterosexual people at some point in their lives will find somebody attractive. The question is what they do with that. And so it's not so much, I think if we expand the definition out to the capacity to be attracted to people of multiple genders, then that is most humans at some point in their lives. If we, however, mandate that results in some sort of action, like going on a date, like speaking and saying that out loud to the person they're attracted to, like having a relationship or sleeping with that person, that narrows it down a lot, basically. And It is probably mostly narrowed down by societal expectations, by both not identifying those feelings when they're there and then feeling like you can't or shouldn't act on them. And sometimes it's a legal question. So sometimes it's very dangerous to act on these feelings depending on where you live in the world or what your community is like. But sometimes it's also just, all we see is straight people. And so all the rom-coms, all the things you've been sold your entire life are narratives about two people, never more, in that opening quote around centering heterosexuality as the sun of our sexual solar system. that's what it feels like, because it's all we see and all we hear. And so quite often it feels like that's the only option. And so we don't even consider, and hence we don't explore those other planets, because it's like, well, there's this huge thing in the middle and it's blinding me, and I really need to put in some effort to go to these other planets and see, ooh, what's on Pan Planet? Ooh, what's on Planet Bi? Ooh, what's on Planet Queer? You know, what are these things, and who is there? And am I allowed to be here? And do I fit here? So there's all these pieces that I think society narrows down, which is, I think it makes a lot of people also really unhappy. Like, I think it really limits people's ability to love freely. And I think that is just a crushing shame.
Yeah. I mean, I could talk to you about this one topic the entire time because I have so many thoughts on it, but everything you just said, I makes so much sense, and it fits with what I went through. And like, so many people I've talked to have had that, experience of, this doesn't conform to what I thought I was, but they don't know what to do with it. And it's like hard to see past the sun. Right. So, okay, let's move on. You quoted Alfred Kinsey in the book, and Alfred Kinsey wrote, "Sexual contact between individuals of the same sex are known to occur in practically every species of mammal which has been extensively studied." So, given that preface, like, can you talk about the Darwinian paradox, which is kind of what I was just mentioning, is like, what is the Darwinian paradox? I'll let you explain it. And what's your like best answer as to how, what's going on?
I love that Kinsey's extension of that quote is that any researcher who looks at this behavior in animals and in humans, as in, for example, mounting, same-sex mounting, and the same animals, then also engaging in reproductive sex, seeing that and like not labeling that as sexual activity is just delusional. So he basically goes on and is like, this is the 1940s, right? Like, we're talking early days. And he's writing just like, you're just a bad scientist if you're just like pretending that's not sexual behavior and just pretending it's dominance, pretending it's something else, because they're having a nice time. Anyone with eyes can see that. And it's the same in humans. I mean, it's the amount that we're told that bisexuality doesn't really exist, or it's performative, or especially for men, you're doing it because you're actually gay. Especially if you're engaging with any kind of interaction with other men, well, you just haven't fully accepted that you're gay. And with women, well, it's performative and you're doing it for the men because, well, it's kind of like in porn, isn't it? But with animals and the Darwinian paradox, what's fascinating is that evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary biologists have long argued that basically the only sensible use of, or one of the main, sorry, but anyone listening, one of the main, and I'm just like, have the evolutionary people in mind who are like, that's not the only thing. Okay. But one of the main purposes in life for most species is to reproduce. And this idea, right, of your genetic survival being this ultimate part of the reason that you do things. And anything else is a waste of resources. And so this is also plays into this Darwinian paradox, is this idea that like, well, but if reproductive sex is the only thing we should be doing, then why does homosexuality exist? Why does any non-reproductive sex exist? Should be the next thought for that, which it rarely is if it's between members of opposite or different sexes, right? This is also something that's curious.
Right. So much sex that doesn't lead to reproduction is going on among straight people too.
And is going on among animals, and there's all kinds of licking and all kinds of like humping that will never make little doggy babies or little monkey babies. Like, that is not what they're doing. And I don't think they're just not sure of what they're doing. I think they're just having a nice time doing these other things, just like humans. And so it's, but as soon as it's homosexual, it's just like, oh, well, it's sort of a genetics gone wrong, and well, they're going to filter themselves out anyway. And yet we still see a lot of homosexual people, and we still see a lot of people who have non-reproductive sex. And so basically what evolutionary psychologists and theorists have some have seeded is this idea that most of this behavior has to result in reproduction, and that actually a lot of flexible sexual strategies are much more useful. So in some ways, being bi, and this is what, so the conclusion of that animal chapter, where I go through all the different animals that are bi, which is basically all of them, or have the ability to be bi, let's say it differently. And it's more about who's around, who, what is my pool that I can select from in terms of partners, both in terms of, partnering up, mating, in terms of, well, not mating in terms of reproduction, but mating as in like finding a mate and, having a nest together. I mean, we know birds, for example, often depending on how the construction of the flock, two girl birds will nest together, for example, and they'll groom each other and they'll protect each other and they'll do the things that people or birds in relationships do. And it's sort of, in many ways, more adaptive to then survive that season if you still find a mate and you're fluid in terms of what it means, what mating means to you. And it's not just about reproduction. And so there's so many layers to this, but basically the moral of the story is basically all animals showcase bisexual behavior, and it possibly is the most adaptive strategy. And certainly homosexuality should not be seen as a curious thing whatsoever. As long as you occasionally still have children, it's fine.
Is there an argument for like that kind of indiscriminate sexuality could actually be evolutionarily advantageous over just heterosexuality?
Yes.
Like what's the argument for that?
It's a much better argument than the other way around. Let's say it that way. There is an argument for that. That is, in fact, so in the book, I talk about some evolutionary psychologists who argue exactly that. They say, actually, there's this assumption, which is entirely, and this is also what Kinsey was saying, it's your cultural bias, is you looking at animals and saying, oh, but that's not a boy and a girl. So those two giraffes, well, two boy giraffes, must be mating, not be mating. It must be a dominance behavior. And that's just you coming from heterosexual human world where that is the norm and applying that to the animal kingdom. And so Kinsey was critiquing that in the 40s, and it's come all the way back around. And in the last couple of years, there's been some big papers on it with evolutionary researchers now also saying, actually, maybe bi is much more adaptive than heterosexual, and let's stop applying our cultural expectations on animals.
You also wrote about bonobos in the book. I think I read it very quickly, but like I've heard this kind of argument that same-sex sex, leads to these different kinds of bonds and different kinds of like family units and taking care of kids and like sharing that parenting among groups. Like, is that something that could kind of be advantageous to keeping your species alive? Like more, like it's more than just this initial conception during sex. Like, can sex kind of contribute to that community in other ways?
Sure. It certainly seems to with bonobos. With humans, I think that it's just so hard to say because there's so much cultural baggage that, involves jealousy, that involves all of these other things, that makes it really difficult to say that sort of consensual non-monogamy, for example, that's sort of the answer to things. I'm not sure that's the answer, at least not in the society we actually live in.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, good answer. So you also wrote in the book about this idea of bent bars and like people who identify as straight having sex in prison, same-sex sex. Like, why do you think that happens? And what about gay sex in other homosocial settings? Like, why does that happen? And what's the impulse to compartmentalize those experiences as opposed to questioning your sexuality?
That's something I wonder with a lot of encounters that people have, is that, again, back to this idea of a lot of people will at some point in their lives find somebody of, the not normal sex that they find attractive. And so that also involves that if you do engage in that behavior, so again, let's take a straight person for once. If you're a straight person or you identify as straight and you fall in love with someone who is the same sex as you or same gender as you, then if you engage, let's say Katy Perry style, you decide to kiss a girl and you like it and you're a lady, then, I know, shock, then what do you do with that information? So now that you've engaged in this behavior, the question is not just so there's sort of all these steps, right? There's the recognizing it as attraction. There's acting on it. So you've done the kissing. Now, how do I understand what I just did? And Katy Perry's song is a good example of how not to compartmentalize it, which is, it doesn't matter. I have a boyfriend. I hope you know it doesn't mean anything to me, which is basically, if you listen to the actual lyrics, I love the song, but oh my goodness, it is very bi-racy. And but in that moment, that is something that a lot of people do. So they basically say, well, but I was drunk, or well, but it was just this particular instance, or well, but I was curious. Not to downplay curiosity. Curiosity is great, but then don't just dismiss it. I think is more the, like, think about what just happened.
Right.
Consider whether maybe you should update your sexual identity and then make a decision. But don't just like fall back into the, oh no, but I'm actually straight, because that's a problem.
Right.
And with prison, what we see quite often is that, so I think it's partly because of, I mean, the argument within prisons, especially male prisons, is, well, access. Like, there's no access to women, so I had to, which is always an interesting argument, because last I checked, nobody actually has to have sex. So, you don't need to for the period that you happen to be in prison. But, and most people don't either. So some people do, and most people don't. But of those people who do, it's often written off as this, well, I would have preferred a woman, or well, but he was kind of like a woman because he was quite a bit feminine, for example. Or, well, and then insert reason here. But again, there are, I'm sure of it, men in prison who realize that they're bi and who realize that they are in fact attracted to other men, because suddenly you also have this huge sample of men, right? You have maybe more men around than you've ever had in your life. And that's what these homosocial environments do, is you're surrounded by people who are the same gender or sex as you. And that basically opens up. It's almost like Tinder. It's like, oh, there's so many of you and we're all about the same age. And you're, more potential sexual candidates than in other settings quite often. And so I think it's also more likely that you might actually find love in that particular environment, even if you don't normally find men attractive.
Really interesting. Fascinating. And I love the idea of curiosity. It's like, yeah, there's so many people who go, have curiosities, but then will minimize them and say like, well, that's just this other thing that happened and it's not really who I am. And it's like, when I came out as bi, I kind of realized, oh, actually, my curiosity is a very important part of who I am. My curiosity has led me to some amazing experiences and things I'm interested in, and like, not just sexual, like in many ways of like exploring new things in the world. And so like curiosity is so important. It's like not something I would want to minimize, and yet many people do.
From research on positive psychology, which rarely happens, even to today. Yeah. You love, good. But for those who don't know it, basically, normally research is done on the bad things that happen psychologically. And so positive psychology is like, actually, let's not just look at disorders and people who think really dark thoughts and do bad things, but actually let's think about why people do good things and think positive things. And so from that, there's a couple of papers, not many, but a couple of papers on bisexuality, which show that freedom is the main thing that people cite as a positive of identifying as bi, is that they perceive a tremendous amount of freedom, both in terms of their sexual lives, but also in terms of their identity, in terms of just how they connect with people. And I've always liked that. And there's a quote so Fritz Klein, who invented the Klein grid, which you might be familiar with, which is sort of like the Kinsey scale, but more complicated. And it lets you sort of organize your sexuality into past, present, and future, which is a really interesting way to think about sexuality. Like, what have you been in the past? What are you today? And what do you want to be in the future? And that's just something that most people never think about, I think. Anyway, Fritz Klein did lots of interviews with bisexual people, and he himself was a bi man in the US, and he would do therapy. So he was a psychologist. He would do therapy with his patients, and one of the parents of a woman he was treating showed up at his office, and he writes about this in his book, The Bisexual Option. And he writes, he's like, so they came and they were basically like chastising him for not trying to talk their daughter out of being bi. So they were like, basically like, why are you humoring our daughter? Like, she's obviously broken and you should obviously fix this. Like, what is wrong with you? And so Klein then writes that the thing that I think it was the father said was, that's the problem. A man here, a woman there. That's the problem. Too much freedom. Since then I thought too much freedom is such a funny way to describe like the opposition to bisexuality.
Yeah, right. It's like too much of a good thing. How can you want that?
Yeah, exactly.
So you have a chapter about coming out, sort of. And I mean, I was going to ask you, but we kind of already covered, like, why are so few bi people out? What are some of the unique challenges to coming out as bisexual? I mean, you can talk about that, but let me also pack it all in and throw you an even more specific question, which is, you wrote about coming out as bi in the workplace too. Like, what are the specific challenges of that, and why do workplaces, in your opinion, need specific bi outreach?
Oh man, it's an interesting way of showing the difference in attitudes towards bisexuality and gay and lesbian identities in places like the United Kingdom and, let's say, big cities in the United Kingdom, and workplaces that otherwise would sort of fly the rainbow flag at Pride Month. You know, there's this category of organizations, this category of cities that are very much brandishing this idea that they are queer inclusive. And yet, in most of these spaces, if you look around, there's basically no bisexual people who are out. And the question there is why, right? That should be the question. That is rarely the question, but that should be the question. And I think what it does is it actually highlights one of the reasons why bi activism is still important, why we still need to keep talking about bisexuality, why this conversation isn't over, because that isn't representative. I mean, the fact that you know a lesbian person and a gay person at work really should mean that you should know at least one bi person as well, because statistically, that's just how it works, right? So
yeah, at least,
or two bi people, really,
yeah.
Statistics, and so, or like two gay men, two bi men, or two bi people, and one lesbian. That's sort of the breakdown, and so it's something that I've actually recently told my mom, because my mom is like, wow, but like, it doesn't really matter, does it? It's sort of like, we're over, like everybody is included now. And I'm like, no, Mom, basically what's happening now in workplaces is that there's still a fear, and correctly so, of being hypersexualized, like I was worried, by saying you're bi. Because most people, what they hear isn't a sexual identity. What they hear is, I like to have threesomes. That is basically what people hear when you say in a workplace, I am bisexual. And so what you get as reactions are either silence, awkwardness, or a reprimand, which basically says, why did you bring sex into the workplace? And you're just like, what? That's not what I did.
Not what I
but
did.
It's exactly the same reaction that gay men were getting in workplaces in the 90s. And so I think we're basically just like 20 to 30 years in terms of that level of acceptance behind gay and lesbian people at the moment. And that's something even my mom was like, yeah, you know what? That is different still. And it's one of those good litmus tests. Would you come out at work? And if not, because most gay and lesbian people at this point, or many, I think most in workplaces, again, in the UK and the US, depending on where you are in the US, of course, are out. And bi people are so likely to be in the closet. Almost no bi people are out of work.
Right. That's really interesting. I never quite thought of it that way because I was not working yet in the 90s. But like, yeah, that people do assume it's a sexual thing. But whereas with gay, and lesbian, we've moved a little bit beyond that. People get that it's like an important part of who you are. You're not necessarily talking about sex alone. But with bi, it's still, that's, people kind of are like, well, why do you need to tell us that if you don't want to be talking about sex? And it's like, okay, you have a lot to learn. There's a lot about it that is important to my identity that's not just about sex.
Right. And the layers to that. So the misconceptions, the myths that come with bisexuality are the same kind, like the amount, and I'm sure this is still true in lots of parts of the world and in lots of workplaces, frankly, but those would probably not the ones that fly the rainbow flag at Pride. That experience is probably still very familiar to lots of people who are gay and come out at work. Is it still this like, well, why are you talking about sex? Like, why are you talking about what you do at like, what do you like go clubbing every weekend? You know, what does it mean? Are you top or bottom? Like all these questions, like all this stuff that happens in places where it's still seen as sex, and it's just still the same for bi people, I think. So why did you start bi, guys?
2019.
No, why?
I think. Oh, why? Honestly, same reason you said, was because I was reading a bunch of books and I wanted to like listen to a podcast about bisexuality, and I just like couldn't find one. I found like a couple that were not great and, small,
Mm.
just like, and like, I wanted to hear these conversations. Like I wanted to hear what the authors of those books I was reading had to say. And I wanted to like hear from bi men telling their stories. And it just didn't, especially for men. There were a couple bi podcasts with women that I thought were interesting, but like didn't totally apply to what I was going through. And Alex and I just wanted to do it.
So, one of the things that I find most interesting about ideas around bisexuality, for those people who are thinking and have ideas about bisexuality, is the complete reversal of whom we assume to be bi. So now there's often, as I'm sure you have also felt, a lack of information and a lack of community for bi men. And there's this idea that when we talk about bisexuality, we're always talking about women. Now that was completely the other way around, even in Fritz Klein's days, where it was assumed that the majority of bisexual people are men. And I find that a fascinating shift. And it's basically that we've, I think, accepted that women also sometimes enjoy sex. And at that point, when sex positivity came in, it's like, oh, wait, maybe these women are not just performing and maybe they are also bi. And maybe more bi men also identified as gay for various reasons. And it sort of just completely shifted whom we associate with this label of bi. And I find it just so interesting.
That is interesting. I hadn't thought about it, but it is like there are more women who identify themselves as bi than there are bi men at the moment. At least that's what the research says. And I wonder if it is due to like, some more progressive feminist movements lately and sexual liberation and like women who can now embrace that and not be ashamed of it. Whereas there's something now about hypermasculinity that is still very homophobic. And yes, it's changing like in New York City and in my circles, that's changing. It's not really cool to be homophobic as a man anymore. But I would imagine in much of the country, there still is something that conflicts between hypermasculinity and fluid sexuality.
Yeah, I think that's right. But in terms of the numbers, you were saying that there are definitely more women who identify as bi. Now it's about twice, and most of the statistics I've seen, it depends on what you're looking at, of course, but I'd say on average it's about twice as many women. And they're also slightly more likely to be out. But again, even that statistic was the other way around, even in Klein's days.
Wow.
And that's not that long ago. So, and Kinsey also wrote exactly the same thing, exactly the other way around. So I just find it fascinating.
That is interesting. Okay, I want to ask you about the show you consulted on. It was a German show in English called 8 Witnesses, and the main character is loosely based on you, I've heard. I haven't seen the show, but I'm going to go check it out. And in the writer's room, you wrote in the book that in the writer's room, you suggested that the character be bisexual, and then they adopted that, but that's not what the show is about. It was just a character thing. So I'm curious, because I'm looking for shows that are doing that here, and they're hard to find. Like, how did the writer's room approach writing her as bisexual without it being the focal point or the main conflict of the show?
It was interesting because she was basically bi. I mean, it was a false memory researcher who worked with the police, and I mean, it was just at one point I was like, because they asked me to be a consultant, and I'm like, wait, is it me? And they're like, yeah, basically. And so I'm like, well, I'm bi, so she should be bi. Like at this point, that's just like, well, if we're gonna go for representation, that's just reality. So go for it. That would be weird not to make her bi at this point. And so they're like, yeah, okay. That's an interesting idea. And so we talked about what that could mean and whether maybe she's like flicking through her phone and she gets a message on Tinder, let's say, from a woman and then from a man or from a non-binary person. There's sort of ways that you could maybe embed it as a side thing, right? Because it wasn't about bisexuality. It was about criminal psychology and memory. But that's in some ways the most beautiful places to put it, where it's just this like side thing that people go, oh, she's bi. You could even have like just a little bi flag on something that she has that in some ways only the community will recognize, but still it's some sort of visibility. And there's lots of ways they could have done it, but in the end they went with nothing. So they're just like, we're going to write it into the description for the actress. And then the actress just like didn't do anything with it. And I was really disappointed.
Oh.
Yeah.
That is disappointing. I asked you about it, but I haven't seen the show, so I wasn't sure the answer, and that is unfortunately disappointing.
Yeah, next time I will be more obvious. I will be like, she wears this in episode 3.
Honestly, it points to the same experience I had at Law and Order, which is like, it is hard to explain this to people and get it in there in a way that like the straight people understand and think is interesting and dramatic. It's like, it's hard to bring them inside our heads. But to me, like, that adds such an interesting layer of how that person thinks about the world and how that person might view lots of things as non-binary or complicated, and like embracing that complexity. But yeah, on a TV show in a room, it can be hard to dive into that, I guess.
What's also interesting about it is that the amount of people in arts and media and TV who are queer is, I would assume, disproportional. As in, there's a lot of queer people in arts and TV. And sometimes I wonder if it's a bit people being almost worried about being outed or being too loud in a room full of people they presume are straight, because maybe they're also pretending to be straight. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I do wonder how much of it's like internalized homophobia and internalized biphobia that contributes to people being like, no, we should just never talk about that, really.
Yeah.
It's starting to change, but it's slow.
I think you're right. And I think it's still at the top levels, there's still a lot of hesitancy about queerness. You wrote in the book a little about parasocial relationships and their prevalence today, like, identifying with TV characters or people on a podcast or influencers on social media. Like, how can we use this idea of parasocial relationships and their prevalence to normalize bisexuality and queerness? Or are there drawbacks to that? Like, how do you see them fitting into this landscape?
So a parasocial relationship, I'm sure you know what it is, but maybe not everyone does.
Please define, yes.
Is a relationship with someone usually in media. So someone on TV or someone maybe now on Instagram whom you don't actually know, but you feel like you know. So I think a good example of that is often like your favorite podcast hosts. Maybe two bi guys, I don't know. And you feel like you're kind of part of the group of friends. You feel like you know them. You feel like you know what they're going to say next. And and you think about them. Like, even when you're not listening to two bi guys, you're randomly like, that's what he would say. And that is a form of relationship. And that is called a parasocial relationship. And within those kinds of dynamics, there's a tremendous potential for introducing people to complexities of yourself and complexities within the world that they might not find in their everyday environment. And so having representation of queer people on screen allows you to have those kinds of what feel like relationships with queer people, even if you live in a place where, for example, it's illegal to be queer or it's illegal to engage in homosexual behavior. And yet you're seeing these, let's say, American shows, for example, and you're going, oh, wait, but I like that character and he's gay or he's bi. So what does that mean? And you need to reevaluate how you think about queer people and how you think about gay people and bi people. Mm-hmm. And so it has this tremendous potential to humanize and introduce this sort of complexity, because when we feel like we know people and when we feel like we like people, it's really hard to then switch to hating them, basically. And what we're trying to prevent is the hatred that is really easy to happen when we see people as different from ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so having those relationships makes them feel part of the group, and part of the group we protect. We don't attack.
Right. I love that. And that's why I think it is so important we get more of this bi representation in media for that reason, especially when it's not necessarily the focus of the show and we're not like forcing acceptance down someone's throat, but actually like, this is a character you love for other reasons. Oh, and also they're bi. And I've felt that on this podcast of like so many, first of all, every listener is my close friend and I love you all. But I mean, I'm being sarcastic, but really many people have written into me and told me like their stories and really intimate stuff. And in this case, I do have the chance to actually read it and respond to most people most of the time. But like, it does point to something that might be missing from regular relationships in the world. Like it is hard to have these conversations and know that you'll be accepted and understood with the people in your life, because like you said, many don't know a bi person.
And there are shows like Sex Education and even more recent shows that really, although I think Sex Education is now in its third season, but there seems to be a move on streaming providers to show good responses. So not just to show people being queer and coming out, but also to sort of model the correct response to that coming out. And I think that is going to have transformative powers as well. So it's not just the tragic queer story. That's not really the representation we deserve. It's the normalcy, and then someone modeling like, oh, that's cool. Or, reacting to it like, oh, okay. So, does that mean you're interested in that person? Like, just like normalizing it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a big deal every time. And that is something I'm like, this year basically is the first year I'm really seeing it, and I'm loving it. And I want more.
Yeah, me too. Last section, I want to talk about politics. You wrote in the book, quote, "Your sexuality is political, whether you want it to be or not." I agree, but I'm curious what you mean by that. Can you explain that a little?
Well, for one, sexuality is a political minefield, partly for everything from reproduction and reproductive rights to marriage rights and whom you're allowed to marry and when you're allowed to marry them, and then of course sex and sexual behavior. So whom you're allowed to have sex with and where and when and all these things. So your sexuality, and whether you're straight or queer, is something that is constantly part of political agendas. And to not see that is to be really quite blind to a significant portion of what has become the culture wars as well. And so when we're talking about trans people, we're talking about gender, we're talking about fundamental constructs, and the way that we then, the things that we decide about gender affect us all. And the things that we decide about marriage and who's allowed to marry whom affect us all. And the things that, all of these things matter more so if you're queer, because in parts of the world, you might be imprisoned, you might be killed, you might be tortured. There are lots of consequences that can happen at the hands of the state and at the hands of people around you that are much more physical and violent in nature than maybe are more common, certainly more commonplace. Of course, all of these things can happen everywhere, but they're more commonplace in certain countries where these things are criminalized. And so that's sort of the most obvious way in which sexuality is political, especially queer sexualities. But it's just, you can't opt out of this stuff.
Yeah, it's all being talked about, and it is definitely part of the culture war, and so we're kind of part of it whether we want to be or not. And
right,
and being out of it, like staying out of the fray, is to me is a political choice in itself.
Oh, totally. You're still taking a stance. Yeah.
Right.
Apathy is a stance.
Yeah, exactly. You also wrote in the book about a slogan in the UK, a political slogan called "No Promotion of Homosexuality" or "No Promo Homo," which reminds me a lot of the "Don't Say Gay" bill in Florida. And they both rhyme. I mean, at least they rhyme. It's kind of nice that they rhyme. But I'm curious, like people, opponents of this, like fear that normalizing queerness will turn kids queer. Will it? And in your opinion, what does making queerness invisible to kids do for them?
So no promo homo is actually a US term. It also relates to the UK. It's fine. Yeah, you're right. It's about not promoting homosexual, well, as the people who argue for this often say, homosexual lifestyles, which includes everything that has to do with homosexuality, including homosexual sex. And it automatically also is bi erasing because, well, bi people sometimes might want to engage in homosexual activities. And so it affects bi people. It's not necessarily bi erasing, but it affects bi people. Mm-hmm. There are other parts, sort of knock-on effects of sex education and monosexism that seeps into that, so that even when you're teaching about sex, quite often it's, again, two people. It's quite often, even if we're talking about homosexual sex. It's in very limited context. It's often only about men because there's concerns about, well, it used to be AIDS, now it's other things. And it's often sort of dressed up in all these health concerns, as opposed to just being like, well, people are going to have lots of different kinds of sex. And it's important that we educate people how to have it safely, rather than pretending that they're not going to have it. And that is just not what humans do. Humans mostly have sex. Of course, there are some who don't, but mostly, at some point, most people are going to have sex, whether you want them to or not. And they're going to do it on their terms often. And so you need to give them the resources to do that. Now, with no promo-homo laws, you're right. It's the don't say gay kind of idea of specifically not being allowed in schools to promote homosexuality. So Texas still has no promo-homo laws, which means that in state schools, technically, you're not allowed to positively talk about homosexuality. You can say terrible. You can say how if you're gay, you're going to get AIDS. That's fine. What you're not allowed to say is that homosexuality and homosexual relationships and all of these things are an acceptable form of life and can be rewarding and beautiful and wonderful. That is what you're not allowed to say.
It's even worse than don't say gay. It's like only say gay if it's denigrating.
Oh, totally.
Queerness.
Yeah. It's you're allowed to talk about the horrors of queerness. You're not allowed to talk about the benefits. And that was approached slightly differently in the UK, in that it was mostly just like ignored completely. More like the don't say gay. But even there we had in the UK also a similar idea of in schools. And so often these things are around schools that you're not allowed to say these things. And often, even still, fought for by usually religious parents. And so the idea being, if you're going to teach my kid this, which I wouldn't teach them this, but you're going to take it over anyway, you're going to force them to learn this basically, then that is going to encourage them to engage in that hedonistic lifestyle and going to draw them away from me and the religious path that I've put them on. And that is... I have a tiny bit of empathy for that stance, more than for some other stances, but it is just not, like, we know that psychologically research clearly shows that the consequences of not teaching kids about these things just means that they're going to have unsafe sex. They're much more likely to get STDs. They're much more likely to be in abusive relationships. They're much more likely to be victims of intimate partner violence and perpetrate intimate partner violence. I mean, the list goes on of the negative consequences that happen if we don't teach kids about sex and relationships appropriately.
Right.
But luckily, that is changing. The UK has massively changed that. And places like California are now requiring, in fact, that LGBT plus issues are not just taught in sex ed, but they have to now also be taught across the curriculum more broadly. So there's hope.
Good. I'm glad. I hope that it changes and these laws go away, because it really isn't going to stop people from being queer. It's just going to cause them to repress it and be damaged psychologically by nobody talking about it.
Yeah.
Okay. I found this really interesting, and it's kind of peripherally related to the politics of it. But can you take us through the 6 stages of bidentity development? And because I think it's was helpful for me to read it, and it's helpful to like place yourself in there in order to be out or do activism. Like it was a useful framework. So
okay.
What are the 6 stages?
The 6 stages of bidentity development are the 6 stages that I went through while I was writing this book, and that I've gone through just in general, interacting with the bi plus and queer community. And it starts with stage 1, which is loneliness, which is basically before you realize that there is a community. You're just kind of on your own. And it's quite lonely. And this is you and me saying, I want more. And this is other people who maybe don't have the ability to go on podcasts or create podcasts, don't have the ability to go and find this stuff, or don't have the right vocabulary to find this stuff. They might never find it. And so that loneliness is something, unfortunately, that a lot of people probably will forever get stuck in. But let's say you make it out. So go you found the bi guys, the 2 bi guys podcast. You know that there's more people out there. And so you're like, okay, I'm no longer lonely, or no longer as lonely, hopefully. And so you move to stage 2. And at some point you feel probably quite euphoric. So the first engagement, certainly for me, with the bi world beyond, my own experiences was like, oh my God, there's so much here. There's so many people here. And there's so much, like, it feels like so much color and just like rainbows and bi flags. You discover the bi flag. You literally discover a new flag. I mean, it's really cool. And so that's where it can be quite euphoric. And then stage 3, out of this honeymoon phase of euphoria, you move to disappointment, which is that you then realize that actually there's a lot of infighting. Actually, there's a lot of people who still call you transphobic when you use the label bi. There's a lot of uncertainty about labels in general, the pi, pan, pluri, all the stuff, omni. And there's a lot of weird fighting. I think I heard you say on a previous episode, it's just this massive distraction. And I think that is mostly right. Like, whatever people want to call themselves, go for it, but don't pretend it's this like massive political debate. It's not actually. It's mostly a distraction that is quite likely to separate our community rather than unite it, and is a really harmful thing mostly. Mm-hmm. Anyway, disappointment. So you have this sort of realization that, oh, there's also trouble here. It's not all perfect. Then there's mourning, stage 4. I certainly went through this, which is that when I learned the discrimination, the psychological consequences of being in the closet, the amount of people who are in the closet, learning about the AIDS crisis and how that affected bisexual men and women, I mean, queer people in general, but also specifically bi men, and how, bi men were seen as bridges between, the dirty queer underworld and the clean straight world. And so suddenly there was this whole like separate stigma around bi men specifically that was separate from gay men. So there's all this stuff that you learn and you go, wow, this is so incredibly tragic. And that's where the mourning comes in. And sometimes people get stuck here. And I see this sometimes, and you can get sucked into the sadness. And this is why I sometimes like to pull out those positive psychology papers, because even in the research, because of how research is funded, most of it is on negative consequences. And so it's really easy to get a super distorted picture of what it's like to be bi, because all the research you read is on the negative sides. And so what you need to do is come out of that and be like, actually, this is just part of it, and sort of use the energy you get from that towards what I call stage 5, which is anger. And so with rage, you then hopefully move through that quite quickly. And you might get angry for a while. I got really angry. I got really angry at sort of the straights. I got angry at the feminists who excluded us in the 80s and 90s. I got angry at all the people who've, quote unquote, done this to us. Mm-hmm. And then finally I found myself in stage 6, which I would consider peace, which is sort of resolving all of this and being like, okay, I'm bi. It's important for me to be visible, also because I'm in a privileged enough position that I can be. And here's what I'm going to do with this, and here's how I'm going to turn this into action. And so those are my stages. So in sum, the stages are stage 1, loneliness, then euphoria, disappointment, mourning, anger, and peace.
I love it. I think I went through all of those too as I was reading them. I was like, yep. And hopefully I'm at peace, although I sometimes have a bit of mourning and anger and disappointment mixed in there.
Oh, you definitely, it's not sort of you don't just graduate and then you're there forever. I think you definitely float between them.
The world always finds ways to disappoint me. But there's a lot of euphoria too. There's a mix in the peace stage. You still get a little bit of everything. Okay, last question. I skipped a whole bunch of things, so everyone go read the book. There's so much more, and there's a ton of stuff about bi history that everyone should know, and some of it we've talked about on the podcast, some of it we haven't. We don't have time. Go read the book. But I'm curious about bi spaces and invisibility. We've talked about bi invisibility, and you've created such an amazing bi space with your social media and with the Bisexual Research Group especially. How would you encourage others to create bi spaces? Why are they necessary? Like, what would you like to see in this bi world in the future?
I think they're necessary partly to find like-minded people, because we just are less likely to feel lonely if you're talking to people, and bisexuality is a thing that you share and have in common, but it's in some ways because of that not something you need to talk about, because you just get it. You just kind of get each other more. Yeah. And you don't constantly have to justify how you're talking about things, especially when it comes to sex and relationships. But it does sort of seep into other stuff too, doesn't it? The sort of deconstructing that heterosexuality as a bi person and those norms that come with it often involves a lot of other new thoughts that lots of other people don't have very often or haven't explored deeply. And so I think within a bi community, we've all had those thoughts, or many of us have had those thoughts. And so it's easier to just like pick up and just, without having to start at the bottom every time and sort of explain your way up to more interesting conversation. So bi spaces and bi community is important for that experience and that fluidity of connection that I think can come fluidity that can come from being on the same page and having had the same thoughts. Yeah. I think one thing that the bi community is actually, I know that one thing that the bi community continues to struggle with is inclusion and diversity. We're a very white group of people. Often the people who create bi spaces and bi communities in particular are often very white. Now, I think quite often that's because white people are disproportionately like to have the ability to come out, disproportionately like to have the resources to, you know, cushion any particular negative repercussions of it, and are less likely to be in religious communities in lots of parts of the world. And so there's lots of other things that interact with whiteness that I think lead to us being in a privileged position to be able to create these spaces, but it can be easy to make them exclusionary spaces. And so in the book, I also write about how there has been a real failure often of bi people to make those spaces inclusive of Black people, for example, and that we really need to get our shit together because there is a huge Black bi community, and to have us like segregated is a bizarre and inappropriate thing to happen. And that is something that we just need to constantly keep in mind. So just making sure that representation in our spaces is also there, and that there is visibility of different kinds of people within those spaces. Because otherwise we're just talking, sort of preaching to the choir and talking to like other versions of ourselves, which is also way less interesting.
Yeah, totally. That's actually something Alex and I talked about when we started this whole thing, was like, you know, we were friends. We wanted to do it together. Like we had sort of talked about it for a while, but like, and we knew we're two white guys, like we are shielded from repercussions in many ways. And we are like, do have a lot of privilege to be able to do this. And so one of our things was like, we really wanted to try to get a diversity of guests on this show. And, you know, we're trying, but like, it's very important. Is there anything that is on your mind that I didn't ask you about, or anything you're thinking that you want to say before we end?
For me, the main reason why I wrote this book, why as a criminal psychologist, I went and did a master's in queer history, which is kind of a wild thing to do. Just like, well, I'm just going to go back to university and study this completely different field just to help me write this book. And I'm going to found this research group in an area that I know nothing about. And I just have lived experience in, but I don't actually have any authority in. To do that, I think the reason why, and what kept me going and what kept getting me motivated when people kept saying, but it doesn't really matter. But you know, bi people, you've got your rights. It's cute, like whatever. And to combat that, I just have to think about the fact that most of the people in the world live in a place where I am illegal, where basically like the way that I live my life is illegal, and I could go to jail. And that is just something that is always in the back of my head, because it's a complete coincidence, a complete accident of circumstance and birth that I am not in a country where I'm not allowed to be bi. And that is, we just all need to remember that all of the time when we're asked why. And it's because we have the ability in other countries where it is legal to have these identities, to engage in these experiences. We have the ability and the strength and the resources to do something and to be more visible and to fight for rights for the people who don't. And those people could so easily have been us had we been born somewhere else.
Well said, and what a nice note to end on. Yes, we live in a global society, and even if we're doing well ourselves, like we do have a responsibility, I think, and we owe it to people to bring everyone along and have everyone experience the privileges we have at the moment.
And even selfishly, for our own survival, rights could be taken away again. I mean, this is not a straight line of progress. We see it in countries around the world that stuff can get stripped back. And so, you know, never rest on your your cushy rights and go, this will always be like this. Nope, not necessarily.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Julia Shaw. This was really fascinating conversation, and it's the tip of the iceberg. The book is called Bi, The Hidden Culture, History, and Science of Bisexuality. It will be out... When will it be out?
June 28th in the US.
June 28th.
And June 2nd in the UK, and May 16th in Germany. I went backwards there, but you know.
Ooh, wow. Cool.
It's also coming on Portuguese and Italian, and then we'll see what other languages.
Amazing. That's so awesome. Well, congratulations on the book. Thank you so much for being here. This was great. I really appreciate it, and nice to chat with you.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for listening to Season 4 of 2 Bi Guys. I can't believe we made it to the end, and we've done 40 episodes over these last few years. Amazing, and thank you all for listening. But there's more to come. I've already got some awesome guests lined up for next season, so there will be another season. I will be taking a short summer hiatus, but I will get back to recording soon, and Season 5 should be out in August. In the meantime, check out the new Spaces app by Hornet, and join the 2 Bi Guys space for some ongoing bi discussion. It's already gotten going there. It's an experiment. We'll see how it goes. Also, stay tuned to our social media. I may do some fireside chats over the hiatus. So until next season, enjoy the month of June. Happy Pride, everyone. Enjoy all the Pride festivities. Have a great summer. See you in August. In fluid solidarity, I am Rob, and thanks for listening to 2 Bi Guys. 2 Bi Guys is edited and produced by me, Rob Cohen, and it was created by me and Alex Boyd. Our music is by Ross Mincer, our logo art is by Caitlin Weinman, and we are supported by the Gotham, formerly IFP. Thanks for listening to 2 Bi Guys.